you don't try, if you don't make mistakes, you never learn, really. We learn a lot more from the things that we don't do well, because that then gives us permission. It also encourages us to take action to change. Whereas if we only hear what we want, what do you learn?
Welcome to the Lara Jane Layton Show. This podcast is for you, the person who keeps putting others first. Your self-talk has held you back. You no longer need to take a second seat. Let's explore ways to overcome self-doubt. You can silence that inner bully voice and achieve your full potential. Here's your host, Lara Jane.
Welcome back to this show, friend. I have a new best friend, Stuart, with me, and we are going to talk about toxicity. Every environment, everywhere you go, there's going to be something that's toxic. It could be minor, it could be devastating. But how do we rebound? How do we get through that? How do we build a relationship when that toxicity seems to be in the way? And Stuart, as our expert today, is going to share that with you. The information about him is in the show notes. So Stuart, help me deal with some toxicity that keeps bumping into me.
Well, thank you first for having me on the show. It's lovely to be here. Toxicity occurs in different ways and it affects different people in different ways. But I think the most difficult toxicity to handle is toxicity at a personal level. So you have a relationship with someone, and either the person with whom you have a direct relationship or somebody else tries to get in to disrupt that. And it's very easy in those situations because our emotions are involved, it's very easy to be stirred up. And if people are anything like me, if we're not careful, we go automatically to the fright and flight mode, which is basically either we run away or we fight. And our temptation very often is when someone's being nasty or being toxic to us is that we respond in like manner. But I think understanding toxic people is really important to knowing how to deal with them because, first of all, not all toxic people are intentionally toxic. And also, there is a group, unfortunately, of people who are intentionally toxic, and dealing with those people is very different. So if you have someone who is simply being toxic because they've been kind of absorbed into their working atmosphere and they've just become like everyone else, if you were to point out to them, that really upset me, or, I'm sorry, but that's the things you're saying are really hurting me and they're not making things easy, that person would step back and go, whoa, I'm really sorry, I hadn't noticed, and would engage in a conversation or a discussion with you. Whereas the intentionally toxic person, if you said to them, well, that really upset me, their most likely response will be to twist that conversation round in some way where you would suddenly be the bad guy and they would be the victim. So if you have people who are intentionally toxic or pathologically toxic, dealing with them is very different to dealing with someone who's just being, pain in the backside really and needs reorientating. So our response depends on who we deal with. I guess if you go just for a general approach, the best thing is try not to be confrontational. So if somebody is looking for an argument, the most effective way to diffuse the situation is to withdraw from the discussion. Or if they want something, it's to give it them without emotion, really. There's a technique that they use when dealing with toxic people called the grey rock technique, which is where the aim is for the person who's on the receiving end of the toxicity to be as interesting as a piece of grey rock. So you respond without emotion, you respond monotone, as fewer words as possible. You give them the information they need, but you kind of keep from engaging with that person.
Well, let's give this a try. Let's try to create an example. So I'm going to be toxic and I'm going to go, Stuart, that report was due on my desk last night. You didn't get it to me this morning, and it's just crap. It's just crap. Why waste my time reading this crap? Can't you get it in a format and on time? How would you diffuse that?
Well, depending on depending on whether they were gunning, you could feel they were gunning for a fight, you would be perfectly within place to say, well, I'm sorry, but I don't think we're in the best position to talk about that now because there's obviously a lot of emotion involved. So I'm going to go away to my desk and I'm going to carry on working. And then when you feel we can have a conversation where we're going to talk to each other rather than shouting at each other, I'll return. So, in some ways you can actually diffuse a situation simply by setting a clear boundary that says, I'm not engaging, and you make that very clear. You tell the person what you're going to do, and then you actually withdraw. Now that may seem quite extreme, and it's not possible for everyone to do that. So the next step is to engage with them in a way that you're kind of, it isn't that you're agreeing with them, but you're not undermining them. So you might say, I'm really sorry, but I used all the references that we'd agreed and the data that we'd agreed, and I have checked it with several colleagues who seem to who were happy with it. What in particular didn't you like? What was it about this report that you found unacceptable? Because what that then does is it puts it back on their turf, as it were, and they have to then engage and they have to answer you with specifics. So if they're just, and it also gives you a good idea, their response gives you a good idea of what you're dealing with, because if they go, oh, okay, and then that's the point you see there's a change in attitude within them, you can see that they've probably, they might have had a bad morning or had someone cut them up in traffic or whatever, and you're the first person that they take it out on. But when you actually give them something rational to deal with, it puts things back in perspective and they're able to step back and say, realize for themselves that they've made a mistake. If they are that kind of person, then you've got a good starting point. If they come back to you, or if you came back to me and said, that's not my problem, that's your problem, you're then in a very difficult situation because there's no resolution point, because they're not going to tell you what the problem is, and so you can't resolve it. And if you remain engaged in that type of conversation, you are guaranteed to get caught in their sort of whirlpool, which just continually spins faster and faster until you get sucked in, and then something happens where you are, you go beyond what you should, and you put yourself in a dangerous situation, either career-wise or, health-wise or whatever. So part of it is just being able to discern whether the toxicity is heartfelt, as in it's part of who they are and you're not going to win, in which case disengage. If you've known your boss, which you probably have for quite a long time, if this is totally out of character for them, then I think you've probably got more hope for resolving it. If this is what they do every time, then that's the time to start looking at a more general strategy of how to deal with them and how to avoid those situations whenever possible.
Okay, so if I'm called out, I'm late and it's not acceptable, I take that breath and say, oh, can you show me what isn't right so I can get it fixed for you as soon as possible? Or, is it something fixable? Is it be more inquisitive and not defensive?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, asking questions is a great way to suppress toxicity when it's not even there. If people are open and inquisitive and ask questions, it drops all those barriers about us having any pretensions of being better than anyone else, because we're saying to people when we ask a question, look, I don't know the answer. I'm relying on you to help me. Please help me. And it then becomes a conversation of peers. Whereas if it's just pure confrontation, there's never any chance of being able to communicate on the same level. It's the only way is either up for them to escalate or down for you with your job. It's
my initial response to that supervisor who was calling me out would be to say, well, you're an asshole. Like, I would be really angry, and it's like, this is an unacceptable way to approach something that you're dissatisfied with. But if I do that, I've just put fuel on the fire. Like, if he's already or they, because I don't know if it's a he or she, is already in a bad mood, and I respond like that, it is going to get worse. And I loved your example of, I'm going to go to my desk. When you're ready to talk about this, I'm happy to get it fixed. And that way you give both of you that diffuse time so that it's not a fire anymore. And so I liked that option a lot, because you can't always respond rationally, but you can bite your tongue and say, let me know when you're ready to talk about this.
And I think with toxic people, if they truly are toxic, they will look, part of the way that they work is to engage you as often as possible in a way that pulls you down or undermines your authority or undermines your self-worth or self-esteem. And so they will take every chance given to them, whether you present that chance or not. They will seize a chance to attack, because one of the common traits of toxic people is that they're deeply envious of others. So if they've seen something in you, for example, either your ability, maybe it's just simply the way you look, the way you dress, the way you walk and your confidence, that kind of thing, that they desperately want for themselves, that is enough of a trigger for them to start looking for ways to pull you down. Because a classic toxic response is, I'm not going to up my game to be as good as you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull you down so that I appear better. And I think it's just it's understanding a few of those the twists in their thinking. You're not dealing, in a truly toxic person, you're not dealing with logical or normal thinking. You're dealing with a totally different way of thinking that is so far outside your domain and way of thinking that you're going to get caught out every time, because the curveballs they pull on you is just unbelievable. And there was a lady I helped. Sorry, I just remembered this.
Good.
But just to give you give you an idea of the scale of the problem. But there was a lady I helped who was going through a separation from an abusive husband. And at one stage, I remember her sitting down and just looking at me, and she said, Stuart, if my story was written as a script for Hollywood and presented, it would be rejected for being too far-fetched. And that's how these people work. They operate in this sphere that is so out of the ordinary and so abnormal that anybody else listening on will go, no, they can't do that. And they manage to hide that side of themselves from the people they want to keep on good terms with, who they can use for their own ends, to the point that they're the opposite with them. And so when you go to that other person and say, this person's a total asshole, the person on the other side says, oh, I think you're probably just having a bad day. And then all they do is repeat what the toxic person's done, which is to doubt your sense of reality.
Right. It is definitely frustrating when it happens, because anytime it happened to me, I was caught off guard. I had no idea that this was going to show up or this was going to happen. And you just like go, whoa, is this real? Like, is somebody really this frustrated? And, sometimes it would be great if you could fix the work environment so the toxic people left and not the non-toxic people. But I know it happens just the opposite. People run from it. They get tired of that environment and it's like, I'm going somewhere else. And sometimes we don't always feel, sometimes that can take too long and our emotions and our self-worth has depleted because we've allowed this person to write stories in our head we think are true. I'm not capable. I don't do this well. I don't. And how can I reframe those stories? And I call that bully. You said it one time, I play it over and over. I doubt myself. And that's that inner cycle that how do I say, I am a good person. I do this well. I have been successful for umpteen years, and this one person is wanting to find fault with everything. How do I that's my rational thought, but emotions don't go there. It's like, I must be bad. How did nobody else find this out? And, so when that toxicity hits us, and it really it's just their pattern constantly. How do we stay in our environment and keep the positive self-talk going on in us I just think it's so important to know that they're not the one who writes our story.
Yeah, that is so true. What happens when we get sucked into these toxic relationships is that it's almost like we're bought, the microscope is brought to us and all we can see is one tiny perspective of a much bigger picture. And when you are on the receiving end of someone who's toxic, part of their intention is to undermine your sense of self so they can control what you do and how you think. And they use this thing, there's a term called gaslighting, which is another word of the minute kind of thing that gets thrown around. But gaslighting in its true form is a psychological abuse that undermines the other person by getting them to doubt their own sense of reality. And so when I'll give you a real life example of how far these guys will go for gaslighting. I mean, this is so extreme that it's ridiculous, but
it really happens.
This really happened. Yeah, I had a friend who was she was my counselor actually, and she had a friend who was worried about her relationship with her husband. So she agreed with this, invited the counselor around as a friend, just to go round, have a cup of tea, but also just to observe because she knew that her husband was going to be around. And the husband stuck his head out of the kitchen and said, "Oh, do you want anyone want a drink?" Bit, nice, cheery self. And she said, "Oh, yes, well, I've 2 coffees." So he went back into the kitchen, and my friend said, I watched him. The kitchen, it was kind of more open plan than through a door, so you could clearly see what he was doing. He made the coffee, and then he poured 3 mugs of coffee out, gave them to the lady and the counsellor, a friend, and said, "Here's your coffee." He said, "But I think I'm having tea." And his wife said, "But you've just poured that in there from the coffee pot." "No, I didn't." "You didn't see that." "I've not. I've actually just made a cup of tea for myself." And my friend said it was disturbing. It was almost humorous to the point of disturbing because this abuser was so convincing and so convinced himself in what he was saying that he was distorting this other person's reality so much that she just imagined what it would be like to live with this guy 24 hours a day and be in the same house. So if someone can do something that is done in front of your eyes and then deny it, that's the kind of length that these people will go to. They'll twist anything to use it against you, to doubt your own sense of reality, to be able to manipulate you. But if you're in a work situation, which is where we were talking about originally, the person who's abusing you is one person. Almost without fail, you will have other people within your work who you've known for a length of time. Maybe you chat to impartially over a cup of coffee. Maybe you talk to, meet up outside and go for a coffee and have deep chats, that sort of thing. Part of undermining or neutralizing toxicity is to actually hear other messages. And so if you're in an office, let's say, for example, you're in an office with 10 people, one's toxic and you're friendly with 6 others, actually spend time with those 6 other people and don't be afraid to ask them, how do you find me? Do you find that I'm, have I come across as being too selfish recently? Or is there anything about me that you've noticed that upsets you, or anything I can do to change? And if you can remember some of the things that this toxic person has accused you of, specifically address those with those other friends. You don't need to tell them that they've been accused of that, but if the toxic person's called you a liar, for example, you can just say, well, do you have problems trusting me? Do you feel easy? If I tell you something, are you doubting me? Or if you tell me something, are you afraid that I'll go and spread it somewhere else? And what you're doing then is you're collecting evidence that outweighs the toxic person, because what they want to be is your focus, because they need you to be their focus so that you can give them this thing they call supply, this kind of validation, whether that's telling them how great they are or it's just having a good argument with them. They'll get validation, they'll get attention however they can. And one of the things they do is isolation is a prime tactic for a toxic person. So they will try to isolate their victim exactly so that they cannot get other views, other versions of reality apart from the abusers. So unless you're trapped in the same room as the person for the 8 hours you're there and not allowed to leave, there will be people around that you can talk to who can bring a sense of balance or bring a sense of reality to your perception. If you're afraid to ask them, drop someone an email. Choose 4 or 5 friends and drop them an email and say, what do you find helpful or good about me? Is there anything that you'd change? And that way, what you're doing is collecting the evidence that is proving that the toxic person's view is incorrect. And that, I'm not saying that rebuilds your self-esteem, but it certainly restores an element of agency, that you're not going mad, you're not being unreasonable, etc.
You say ask, ask, do you trust me, to other people? And I'm wondering, would they dare be honest at that moment? And I'm wondering if I said something like, can you give me an example of where you didn't trust what I said or didn't trust my work package, where they could really pinpoint it. And if they come back with, I can't think of one, you're not like, am I trustworthy? And I think they're both great approaches, but I think one's going to get you a little bit more targeted to what you're wanting, that give me an example of when you couldn't trust me. And that way it's kind of that open, it's not just an open yes, no, but they have to think. But it's great. I don't know. I have never done that. I've gone in and bitched and moaned and complained about the person who also is not being nice to someone else, but never have I done that. So what a great thing. I would love to talk a little bit more in depth about how to do that questioning so that we're rebuilding our own personal confidence without that toxicity in the room. So let's take a quick break, get a word from our sponsor. Come back. Let's explore this a little bit deeper, because I think It's going to help us a lot. And even when a minorly, I'm just in a bad mood today, toxic person, be able to get through that. So we'll be right back. Hey, since I rarely have openings in my coaching schedule, I have a new resource out there on my website. It is called the BFF Coaching Network. And I have offered a spot there for any coach that has been on the show to list their coaching. You can go out there, you can listen to their episodes, you can feel a little bit about them, and then choose a coach that will work for you. So LauraJaneLayton.com, the BFF Coaching Network. All right, Stuart, help me keep talking about ways to inquire if I'm losing my mind or if this person gaslighting me is right or not, because I'm starting to doubt myself. And I know that all of us that deal with toxicity have that little bit of doubt. Like, is this true? Even though it's not, we still take that moment to think about it. So help me think through the process of regaining my own sanity.
Yeah, I mean, the first place for me to start here is that this is, we're kind of entering into the sphere of this kind of thing doesn't just look after itself. If people are seriously concerned about losing their sense of identity or self-worth, then actually finding, a qualified counselor, therapist, or whatever, particularly someone who's trained in what they call trauma-aware therapy, because people who've been involved in toxic relationships, when they come out of them, there is a trauma bond, it's a trauma response that they've had. And therefore, if you actually get the wrong counselors, for example, then they run the risk when you tell them these stories of what's happened of saying, are you sure? And in which case, that's all they're doing is reinforcing what the toxic person has done. And yet, if you get someone who's trauma aware, they know definitely how to approach that, how to approach that sensitively and powerfully. But from someone who is looking on and who's had experience of this kind of thing, I think your point of keeping the questions open. I mean, let's be blunt, I'm a scientist. I tend to go straight for the jugular. I'm not quite, I do have plenty of grey areas, but when I say ask questions, do you offend me? That's kind of scrunching everything into a short sentence. The best way is exactly as you've said, keep it open and keep the questions inquiring in a way that allow the other person to speak as well. So, great example, I said, is there any way that you'd find me difficult to trust? You can have a yes or a no answer to that. Whereas your approach is, give me some examples. Immediately what that does is it actually allows you to step back and get a bit of space to sit and listen. And it gives them, that in itself gives them the space and almost the permission to talk to you quite frankly. Now, who you choose to have these discussions with obviously depends. If you've got someone who you've only met them yesterday, these are probably not the best people to ask these questions to. I think you do have to, we are human and humans have that depth of relationship, and we have to find those people in whatever environment we're in that we trust. Or even if there's no one at work that we're close to, if we've got people outside of the work setting who know us when, in everyday life, they will still be able to give us a pretty accurate picture of what we're like in terms of temperament and responsiveness and openness and that kind of thing. So keep the questions open. Also allow them to speak from their perspective. So again, as you rightly said, tell me or let me know, is there anything that you've found? So you make it personal to them, so they speak from personal experience rather than doing it in like a meeting where it becomes one person's voice becomes the consensus of the whole group. If it's a positive affirmation, that's brilliant. But if someone's got doubts and you've got 10 people in a room, that is you really feel like a rabbit in a snare in that situation. So keep the questions open. Ask them about things, I think, that are comfortable with answering, because I think when we ask these questions, very rarely is it spontaneous. If someone said something to us, what happens? We sort of reel, we sit back, we think about it, and then we think of a strategy for solving it. So if we're going to think about, well, I need to ask questions here, we can perhaps think about who we're going to ask and what sort of questions we can ask them. Maybe even just write them down somewhere and have a record, so that when we come to ask the people, we're asking the people within their zone of comfort. We're asking it within their zone of knowledge. And also we're asking it, as a friend to a friend. So we're saying, you can say what you like, basically. We're not saying that exactly, but we're actually saying to them, I'm here, I'm open, I'm listening. I've done my talking. Now I'm going to listen to what you say. And if they're talking to you and there's something that you understand and that really, really encourages you, don't be afraid to say thank you, to acknowledge that. Maybe sometimes even reflect it back to them. So what you're saying is that in these situations, you found me to be really helpful. And they say, yes. You say, oh, thank you. That's really nice. That means a lot to me because I hadn't realized that. And so you can make the conversation two-way, but it's almost, although you've asked them for the question, or you've asked them the question, and you've asked them for the answer, it's almost as though that is a two-way conversation. So when they finish with the conversation, they're also coming out of it feeling, oh, I'm glad I said that, or I'm glad because we don't know that they might well be feeling totally rubbish about themselves as well. Most of us are underneath this, the facade that we carry around. And so to be able to be involved in a conversation that's quite deep, potentially threatening in some ways, but then come out of that feeling, I was able to be open and honest, and actually I'm kind of helping this other person as well. You then mutually benefit rather than it just being the victim sucking everything from the people around them.
You're right. But what if they did have examples of, well, I didn't trust you here and I didn't trust you there. And you're starting to feel like, oh my gosh, I think it's really important that we keep that environment safe. Thank you for your feedback. I really appreciate it. I can use this to change or to refocus the way I present things. And that way they're not feeling like, oh, she's going to hate me forever. Or it's like, so we've talked about responding to the positive, but what if it's not? And making sure you're leaving that safe and not become argumentative, because you'll never get the feedback again if you do.
No.
They'll just say, I choose not to answer.
Yeah, and I think if you're having the thing is that if you're having a conversation with somebody, that you are relying on them being honest and they are relying upon you being honest. And so if you are asking them or giving them chance to speak, there is that sort of openness, there is that trust that's there, because even if someone comes back with something that you don't like, you've asked them the question. So you can't, the classic toxic thing is there anything about me you don't like? Yeah, you're an arrogant pig. Oh, that's not right. It's your trouble. Look at you insulting me now. You're not going to come back as a toxic person and attack them. And I think that's why the safety aspect, as you say, is very important. And also being able to hold the conversation in the right place at the right time. So that you, over a coffee or in someone's front room, wherever it is, as long as that space is safe and as long as you are both comfortable with being able to give and to receive, and also be able to say thank you. It's that being able to say thank you and being able to receive difficult feedback is probably one of the most liberating experiences that you can get. Because I think when you can do that, you've gone beyond the knee-jerk reflex, the defensiveness, which is classic toxicity anyway. The toxic person builds this barrier around them to keep people out. And then if people get too close, then they'll start using toxic behaviors to push them away again. And so as human beings, that doesn't do as much good, because the thing we talked about, communication, relationship, and trust, those things in a toxic situation are destroyed. And so the whole framework that supports the friendship or the relationship falls apart. And so if you can engage in activities that actually positively reinforce that relationship and reinforce that trust and reinforce that, good, wholesome communication that means something, then you come out of that. Yeah, we come out with ego might be dented or whatever, but if we don't know, it's like people, I say to people, if you don't try, if you don't make mistakes, you never learn, really. We learn a lot more from the things that we don't do well, because that then gives us permission. It also encourages us to take action to change. Whereas if we only hear what we want, what do you learn?
I do enjoy positive feedback. It's great. But I also appreciate constructive feedback. Like if this had happened. And so being prepared for either when you go into this conversation. And I loved the safe environment. Don't do it where you don't feel safe. Make sure that this is the way we're going to diffuse what happened with the toxic person is working with a non-toxic person. You could get the same answer. You could get, yes, every time you deliver a paper to me, I have to fix it. I've just never said anything. It's like, please next time, show me what I'm missing so that you don't always have to fix it. And come in with that, I want to learn from this and I want to be better. And then you've built that open environment that you're talking about. And I think that that's really, I'm trying to think back to that very toxic environment that I was in. And had I had some honest conversations, would it have changed? And I think I still would have left because that toxic person never stopped hammering on you. Like if you're a tree and someone's hammering on you, you don't get to move. But I'm a person and I'm getting hammered on. I can move and I can make that choice. And so if you can't fix the problem that keeps coming at you, even with all the positive people around, give yourself permission to make a change. Get away from the toxicity so that you can be your best self.
Yeah, and I think it's worth remembering as well, one of the things about toxic people, especially narcissists, is that they require compliments, they require attention, they require adulation. This is what they're after. This is what makes them feel good, which this is basically what gives them their reason to, stay alive. And so there is absolutely nothing wrong with, even when you're interacting with a toxic person, to find something positive in them that you can use, which softens the atmosphere between you. If you come into the office, if they're looking for a good fight, the first thing you say when you come through the door is, "I'm sorry, I have to say this, but you just look great today." And if you know what the buttons that press them to make them feel good, there's absolutely nothing wrong in using those to help suppress or keep down their level of anxiety, which it quite often is. feed them something good, because everyone likes compliments, even toxic people. And learning to do that in a way that enables you to get through the conversation is a lot more helpful than going in and either having no idea of any strategy or knowing, or going in and just winding them the wrong way.
If we took our original role play and you didn't have anything, he didn't look great today, or, anything that you could point out, you could say, I really appreciate your feedback, letting me know this didn't hit the mark. I would love to discuss it further if you could point it out so I can do better next time. And now you've just told him, thank you for being rude. No, thank you for pointing out. It's the words and the thing that they said, not the tonality. If you can get rid of the tone and get rid of the other, okay, this person's frustrated. Thank you for bringing it to my attention. I would love to fix it. I have some time this morning. Could you show me what you need to have done? You've given it that opportunity. Or I have to take a call. Do you have time in 30 minutes so I can fix it? If you need that time to diffuse it, you can blame. I have a couple things to do, and one of those things could be calm down. You're not lying.
Yeah. With all toxic people, whether it's intention day, to approach the situation where your aim is to suppress emotions and keep emotions down and be more factual and give them less things that they can put their hooks into, that's the better, really. Because a lot of people, even the toxic people, they may love a good fight, but even they can be caught off guard. And if the root of if it's something like narcissism or sociopath or whatever, if it's a definite personality disorder or trauma response, these people are going to have so many bricks in their wall already to build the defenses that you've got no chance of getting over without getting shot before you get near the top. Whereas to actually be able to do things which brings that wall down, even if it's only temporarily, or it gets them to see you making an attempt to have a conversation up, but equally the fact that you're taking the steps, it's just one more reason for them not to be able to have a go. And I think if you are in a toxic environment, a really important thing to remember is that these incidents, for someone who is more pathologically toxic, these incidents are not going to be isolated. They're going to be frequent. And therefore, there is a case for just quietly keeping a record of your interactions with them, record, words that were said, time, date, etc., and keep that somewhere safe. It could be kept on you. It could be kept in a journal or a diary that you keep in you keep locked away or you carry on you or something. But just keep a record of the encounters that you have with toxic people, because when you come to have to defend yourself, the first thing you're going to be asked is, well, can you give me any examples? And therefore being able to open it up and say, well, yeah, I've got these examples. Here we have 50 examples over the past 2 weeks, for example. It's very difficult then for them to just dismiss that and say, oh, it can't be happening, because the very fact it creates, almost a document, if you like, that's your little body of evidence. It can be really, really helpful, especially if you have to go and get the thing resolved by HR, or if you have to kick other things into action.
I love it. And what great ways to approach, handling that toxic person and handling your own self-esteem in the process. We don't have to lower or dishonor our own personal growth because someone else thinks we're not perfect. And so taking that step back and giving us that time. And even though you're not fixing or removing that weed from the organization, you've now put yourself in an isolated pot
Yeah.
where that weed is not infecting you. And it's the only thing you can do is change you. We can't change others. We can only move forward. So, Stuart, let's wind down. Why don't you tell them about your book and who you are? And then what's that one thing we can do this week to kind of take back our own power?
Sorry, it's okay. It was buffering a little bit there, and I suddenly realised my computer had switched to a different network, which is not good.
We have had several pauses that I've written down, but the good news is on the pauses is it only buffered, and I got the whole sentence. We're just going to have to take out the pause. So let's go ahead, and you can start with telling them about your book.
Oh, right. Okay. So yes, I've the book I wrote really, it's almost a diary of personal experience from helping this lady who'd been involved in a marriage, 15, 18 years of narcissistic abuse without realizing it. I happened to be in hospital at the time, and I think hospital patients are a little bit like hairdressers. They're the perfect audience for people to chat to. And she was chatting to me about her situation, and it very quickly became apparent that it wasn't a normal situation. There was something quite difficult going on. And I'd known her and her husband for 12 years already anyway. So it was a great example to me because I hadn't seen anything particularly out of place from the outside, but from things that she'd shared with me privately or just quietly on the side, there was clearly a discrepancy. And so when she decided to leave her husband, I said, well, I'll support you with this. And basically she went through 3 years of hell trying to divorce him, had to live under the same roof because he'd got all the money. So, and then it's when you get a little insight into how these people really work behind the scenes, and you see how they really act, that kind of reveals what toxicity is really like and how dangerous it can be. And so the book came out of my experience through probably 3 to 4 years that I was supporting her from the beginning through to the end. And because I'm a neuroscientist by training, so I come from a sort of science background. I like to do the research. That I also put into the book, if you like, best practice from people who are recognized as therapists or experts in the field. So it's really a book that'll take someone through from being ignorant of what narcissism is to talking about narcissism, talking about the victim, talking about the kinds of things they feel. It talks about the importance of a supporter, which is what I was, and that's the perspective the book's written from, someone who's supporting someone who's going through it. And then it goes through about, eventually towards rebuilding your life. But because, as we were talking about at the beginning, I think before we even went on air, where a toxic person is, they're toxic. They don't change. And so they are the universal soldier. You can take them, put them in any situation, and they will destroy it without any effort. So also I've tied a few things in the book about dealing with toxicity at work, dealing with toxicity in the community and family relationships and things. So it's kind of a story with little things woven in and things on the appendages. It's called Escaping the Void: How to Support People Out of Abusive Relationships. And it's not a self-help book, but it is, I would call it a handbook for people to refer to, because I'm not a counselor, I'm not a therapist, but I class myself as an educator. And so it's written from the perspective of someone who wants to share with others about narcissism and share with them in a way that they can quickly understand and not only read about it, but apply things to their own lives that enable them to, what I call, neutralize the effect, which is basically to exist in the same space as a narcissist, which is usually the first step before people actually move out and move away from the situation.
This is going to be great. I think we all know that toxic person. And if we're having a hard time dealing with it, what a great book to be able to pick up and learn from. So, Stuart, what is that one thing that we can practice this week to help us move forward?
I would start with myself, which is very, very unusual for me to say that, because I'm a beggar for thinking of everyone else and not myself. But the thing I'm learning is, unless we believe things ourselves and believe that we are worth it and we are worthy, then it's very difficult to accept anybody else's advice to help us change. Because, if we don't believe in ourselves, we've got very little chance of changing, because the only person who can change us is me, or is us. So try and find something each day that you can be thankful for in your life that you are good at, and remind yourself of that each day, when you get up, and also remind yourself of it each night before you go to bed. And it sounds a bit kind of EBGB kind of, things, but what it's doing is it's basically retraining your brain to think in a different way. And we know, I do a lot of work with fears, for example, I have done. And the best way for many people to overcome fears is to basically confront it head on. I use snakes and spiders and things to help people face the fears. So I find plenty of people with fears in the group that I meet. But once you've got people to face that fear and confront it, to acknowledge that it's there, and then take the step of having a go, you can see very quickly in many people who've got what they would class as phobias, a complete change round and switch, that it's no longer that they're going to die because they're in the presence of a snake. I've had people who've said, I might even have a snake as a pet. And so they shift from being absolutely scared stiff to being prepared to have a go. And the reason they're able to do that is that encounter has basically changed the way that their brain thinks, or it's rewired the brain, to use a technical term. And so particularly those of us who are not good at self-affirmation, to be able to just engage in that daily and remind ourselves it's not about blowing our trumpet and thinking how great we are. It's finding something that we can truly believe and know that we're good at. Remind ourselves of that, think about it for a bit. Just doing that on a regular basis means that when we come to those crisis points where suddenly a toxic person undermines us and says, you're worthless, effectively, or that's how they make us feel, we've got something to go back to, which in our head, if not with our mouth, we can say, no, you're wrong. I'm not worthless because, and you've got these one or two things in your head that will keep you sane, basically. That's the only way I can describe it.
Okay. I like it. I'm kind of like thinking back to that scenario we did. And in that case, if I was going to write that affirmation that I said to myself every day, it would be something like, I do good work and I'm willing to do better work. And that way you're acknowledging it's okay to get feedback. You do good work and you're willing to change.
Yeah.
Perfect. I love it. Thank you so much, Stuart, for joining me today. It has been so much fun and informative. I've really enjoyed the conversation. So Stuart and I are not medical or mental licensed professionals. We're here for entertainment. People that want to help you walk down a smooth path to your goals. So stay tuned for the next episode.
Are you tired of waking up exhausted? You are not alone. If you're looking to take your life back, let's start with the simple step of adjusting your self-talk. Stay tuned for the next episode with your host, Lara Jane. Remember to follow the show so you don't miss a next simple step that you can use to feel more confident. And please leave an honest review.